But first, the greatest strengths we have in the West are our heritage of reason and rational thought, our Judeo-Christian values, which include charity as well as self-reliance, our democracy, our right to speak up without fear or favour, and our strength of character and purpose in difficult times. Last week I criticised the government for its inconsistent, illogical and frankly half-assed response to the coronavirus crisis, saying that we had a fortnight to avoid an Italian-style scenario, so we'd better get our skates on. Scott Morrison and his team, clearly keen outsiders watchers, took the advice pretty well and have performed much better since then, but not unfortunately quite well enough in my opinion. Despite being a nation of pro-surface, we still appear to be paddling furiously to catch up with the wave rather than getting out in front of it. As we saw at Bondi Beach, the narcissistic millennials aren't really taking the virus seriously at all, partly, I suspect, because of the hitherto confused and inconsistent messaging. Oh, and for all you kids who think the virus is only attacking old people and men...
If anyone... If anyone is thinking of taking any chances, just take a look at me. I'm in the intensive care unit. I can't breathe without this. They've had to sew that into my artery. I've got a cannula, another cannula, and a catheter. I'm actually 10 times better right now than what I was before.
I believe we should have gone in with stricter measures much sooner, including scrapping crowded tourist events like the Mardi Gras, for instance. In my opinion, there were and are only two logical approaches to the virus. Ignore it and live with the consequent number of deaths, as some appear to be advocating, or defeat it as swiftly as possible. The problem is that if you choose option A, to ignore it, it could well spread and mutate to such an extent that the death and destruction would be even greater than any self-inflicted economic harm caused by fighting it. Without a vaccine, it is idiotic to let the pandemic spiral out of control. On the other hand, once you've decided to pursue option B and fight it, there can be no half measures. It's a war that can only be won by fighting on all fronts as decisively and as rapidly as possible. And plenty of countries do appear to be getting on top of it. Let us be one of them. In my opinion, we should be shutting down our schools and universities immediately and hunkering down now. On the upside, think about it, if our kids were forced to stay at home to study, they would probably get a much better education than they currently do anyway. They might even learn some maths and science and English and history rather than Marxist ideology and climate change claptrap. Who knows? They might even outstrip Kazakhstan one day. Let's stop faffing on about toilet paper hoarders and global depressions and concentrate on pulling together to beat the bug. One of the great strengths in the West has always been our technological inventiveness and creativity. Already we are seeing examples of that creativity that are both encouraging as well as a little revealing. The vast majority of people admitted to hospital after testing positive for COVID-19 do require ventilation to breathe as their immune system fights off the infection. The reason for slowing down the curve of infection is to ensure that there are adequate ventilators and adequate beds available. The deaths in Italy, the UK and elsewhere are because there are not. One brilliant Canadian doctor has figured out how to turn a single ventilator into 9 ventilators simply by watching a DIY video on YouTube. A slightly more worrying story is to me a metaphor for what has gone wrong with the West and in particular Australia. The UK government has had to approach several large British firms like Dyson, Rolls-Royce, Philips and others to start producing ventilators. At least in the UK, unlike here, they actually still have those sorts of firms to approach. Our manufacturers have all long fled these shores thanks entirely to our ridiculous unionised high wages and costs of production. But, and it's an even more telling metaphor, the Daily Mail reports that the Brits may be forced to manufacture the old-fashioned mechanical ventilators because the electronic parts for the sophisticated new ones are all in short supply and manufactured, of course, in Asia. On the brighter side, I mentioned creativity, and here's a classic example. A Scottish beer company called Brewdog has started making alcohol hand gel at its distillery in Scotland. They've called it Punk Sanitizer, after their leading beer. Brewdog isn't alone. Other brands such as Christian Dior, Givenchy and Absolute Vodka are suddenly turning their hands to hand gel. Good. And be heartened by the tale of the small town in Italy called Vaux, right at the centre of the virus. The local townsfolk took matters into their own hands and have got on top of the contagion already, simply by a strict lockdown and blanket testing of every single resident. We will bounce back from this, and I believe we will bounce back stronger and sooner than the authorities are saying, but only if we fight in a determined and single-minded fashion now. The scenes at Bondi Beach in the electorate of Wentworth were a farce. What a surprise. The very electorate who are loudest about catastrophic climate change and open borders are nothing but selfish hedonists when it comes to making even the slightest effort to avert a real crisis. Perhaps I'm being unfair. I'm sure the current member for Wentworth, who is so concerned about carbon emissions, was down at the beach telling everyone to keep a safe distance apart. And I'm sure the previous member for Wentworth, a doctor no less, who was so concerned about Manus and Nauru, she'd have been down there handing out the hand sanitizer and face masks, I'm sure. And I'm sure the member for Wentworth before that, before her, who was so concerned about saving the planet, he'd have been busy tweeting from his Harbourside mansion how we've only got a couple of weeks to tackle catastrophic corona contagion. And that, of course, is the rub. The luvvies have so traumatised the country for a decade over fake and imaginary crises, one after the other, that they are hopelessly clueless when it comes to a genuine one.